Hello everyone. So in this video we're going to be talking about the beginnings of philosophy, well, in a conceptual sense. We will have another video in which I'll talk about the socio-political, historical and geographical sort of, explanations for the beginning of philosophy. But let's look at it conceptually, why did philosophy begin? How did it come to be at all? So the beginning of philosophy, one of the reasons, the time that we're looking at in Greek philosophy, one of the reasons was a desire to find order and structure in the world. So we already talked about cosmos, and that's part of the title of our course as well, cosmos. So there was this sort of, because the world is a confused, the world can be seen as a confused set of events, one thing happening after another, things changing, shifting, and there seems to be no sort of logic, structure, anything to it. So this sort of, the sort of, it began with a desire and a conviction that there is an underlying cosmos, an underlying order beneath this sort of, chaos of events. There's a chaos of events around us, and beneath that there is some sort of an order, some sort of a structure, and there's something that we as humans can discern. Because there might be a structure, but it might just be visible to some kind of a superhuman being or to a supernatural being, then that doesn't help us much. So the idea that there is some kind of an order and a structure, and we as humans can have ways of understanding and documenting this order, and in fact then making predictions based on it. So I would say that is the initial beginning of philosophical thinking. And maybe it was not called, when it started, it might not have been called philosophy at first. In fact, it wasn't called philosophy at first. But this is, I would say, the seed of philosophy, right? The starting spark of philosophy, this sort of desire to find order. And in the Greek world that we're looking at, there was also a desire, and it's related to this desire to find order, a desire to move away from sort of mythological and religious explanations, which are beautiful and nice and, and sometimes quite satisfying for a lot of us. But they don't sort of give explanations that we can then make predictions based on. They don't give explanations that we can sort of bank on, let's say. We can't count on them. So if, in the last video, I gave the example of why do we have thunder? Because Zeus got angry. Why do we have rain? Something happened. So if you keep turning to like, why do we have a rainbow? So Iris felt like flying through the sky. I don't know. So if we keep turning to these, so gods are, it's a whim, it's a caprice of the gods. So if we keep turning to the caprice of the gods, the problem is that we don't have a direct line to these gods to ask, okay, what's going to happen next? And also it's a caprice, that if the gods decide, then something happens. If not, then, so there would be no predictability to phenomena. And if there's no predictability to phenomena, which means that there is no order, yeah? So there was a desire to come to a more rationalistic and scientific or proto-scientific, whichever way you want to think about it, or natural at the very least, natural explanation for the structure of the world, for change, for events, for the sequence of events. So that is another sort of, seed of philosophy, is what I would call it. Then there was a search, there was a search for a sort of, what the word that they used was arche. So this arche was the kind of, it means beginning, but it also means something that leads, right? So it's the search for the beginning of the world, and the idea that there is some one thing, and sometimes people had like, more things that it would develop into, but the idea that there is one explanation that we could go to. There's this desire for like a primary sort of principle, a primary idea, primary matter, a primary anything that could explain the sort of, ordering and structuring and the beginning of the world. So there's this search for this, like the first explanation, for the first principle. In fact, we still do it. If you think about it, what you're doing with the Large Hadron Collider, for example, is a sort of a search for an arche. I mean, I might not understand it perfectly, the physicists among you can discuss this further, but there is a desire to find, a one unifying principle, So this is the one unifying first principle. So think of arche as that. Then the search for the arche could also be a search for a god. But the desire at that time, the philosophical desire, was actually to abandon the mythological solutions, and to look for the causes of the natural world in the natural world. Right? The idea that there is a rational and intelligible order behind, but this rational and intelligible order is not something supernatural. Right? That the rational and intelligible order comes from the nature itself. And as I said already, that our human reason, logic and reason, human reason is capable of finding this natural explanation. As I said, if you give it over to the supernatural, we could decide that, okay, maybe the arche is supernatural, it's something that we cannot sort of get to. But then we then become less capable of finding this arche. Right, so there is this double thing. So one, that the arche is in the world, in the natural world, and that's why we can find it. We are capable through logic, through reason, to find it. Right. So there are these two things out here that we will talk about: both logos, logic, discourse, narrative, reason, word, human language, which can find explanation for things, and you have physis, nature. Right, which helps us, which is there for us, which is our main sort of area of observation, because we really cannot observe and find gods, but we can observe and see trees and water and wind and all these things. So the idea that that we can have this sort of logos that goes with physis to sort of explain physis and tell us about it. So the first line of Aristotle's metaphysics is pantes anthropoi tu eidenai oregontai physei. By nature, all humans long to know. Right? Now, this is what we could think of as the origin of philosophy. So there is something that, this is a packed sentence. It's from Aristotle's Metaphysics, packed sentence. First, one of the words he uses, all humans, right? So it is not something that belongs to some humans, pantes anthropoi, right? All humans. Physei, by nature, right? By nature, they long, right? There is some kind of a longing, oregontai, the word he uses, this sort of desire, a longing, for what? For knowledge, to know, eidenai, which also actually is related to the word video, to see, and vidya, for example, in Sanskrit. So this desire for knowledge is a desire to know, to see, to understand, and Aristotle says that the source of philosophy began in wonder. When humans began to wonder why this and why that, and how this and how that, and so that would be the beginning of philosophy. In fact, Plato before that in Theaetetus said that the beginning of philosophy is curiosity. You're curious about things. So philosophy is the desire, the longing to get to the source of things, to get beneath sort of facile, like just observation of phenomena and practical use of the observation of phenomena, to a desire to go beneath it and to understand. These days we distinguish science and philosophy by saying that science is knowledge that serves a practical purpose and philosophy is knowledge for its own sake. But in those times, science and philosophy were both pretty similar. In fact, preceding science, we would have had technology. right? We would have had things that came from art, from craft, from techne, from human sort of ingenuity in creating things, in creating tools that would help them survive, survive the world in some ways, So the fact that they could use fire to cook, which made it easier for them to eat, to keep them warm, to keep off animals, and the development of tools and technology in some ways would have, I would assume, preceded science or philosophy. Why? Because the first sort of necessity is survival. First comes food and then comes morality, as Brecht says. So this sort of desire for food comes first, of course, is sort of my hypothesis. But at some point, when you have had enough food, when you are not worried about like, will I survive to the next moment? When you have, let's say, less worry about surviving to the next day or month or year, we do, and that's what Aristotle says, and I do sort of agree with him on this at least, not on everything that he says, but on this at least, that we do have a desire then to find out more, to understand. We are in some ways by nature curious. We are by nature, people who wonder, who are curious about, why do things happen in this way? How do things happen in this way? And I'm sure all of you would attest to that. So in some ways, it becomes knowledge for its own sake. Let's say it begins to become knowledge for its own sake. It doesn't remain knowledge for its own sake, in fact. And that you would all sort of, also observe that, let's say you start with technology, in a sense, let's take the basic technology of, you can start fire and you can cook. And then you think, okay, what makes fire hot? What makes fire sort of work in this way, let's say. So then what do? You basically try and observe and try and get to sort of deeper explanations for the nature of fire, let's say. You try to get to, beneath the sort of surface use of it, and you get to a better understanding. But that better understanding might actually let you develop more things. Might actually help you develop more complex technology after that. Yeah. So you could maybe, you have discovered fire, but then you discover, for example, that, when you heat water with fire, then the water sort of, starts to move, becomes warm, all kinds of things. It evaporates, that steam can be used to cook. I don't know. I mean, I'm just coming up with like the simplest explanation out here. But so you have, it's a circle, in some ways, between science and technology, if you want to think of it that way. And here, when I use the word philosophy, in fact, the word philosophy in this case, well, with the first thinkers at least that we'll be discussing, is the same as science. It is a kind of epistemic, quest. It's a quest for knowledge and understanding, but that knowledge and understanding can have practical purposes. So, Greek philosophy, let's say, began at a time and in a place, in fact, where you had the comfort of knowing that you would get your next meal and you would be safe at home, you had a house. So it began it might have begun earlier. Our earliest sources actually are Thales, I keep pronouncing it incorrectly, Thales is the correct, with a th, Thales of Miletus. Yeah. Miletus, as I said, coast of Turkey. And this sort of, the beginning of philosophy was also a kind of hostility, or I wouldn't say hostility to the traditional religion and traditional gods, but more of a agnosticism about the traditional sort of gods, in the sense that they said that, well, the gods may or may not exist. We don't know. I mean, I don't know if they said that. I mean, you will see that we are reconstructing a lot of stuff from that time. But the explanation that we will come up with will come via nature, right? So the idea was that we want a free debate of reason rather than religious dogma. the religious sort of dogmatic approach, to provide answers, to provide causes of the world. So the conceptual reason for, because that's what we are discussing out here, for the beginning of philosophy would be that they asked why. The first question that they asked was why, right? And this why was this demand for causes, which was then a further demand for explanation and generalization. Not just why is this why is this table here because I put it here, but why is this table at all? How did the table come about? It came from the carpenter, wood, etc. Why is there wood? Why so it's like going backwards with more and more why questions. So these why questions were obviously asked before, because as we just discussed, science and technology are interconnected. We would not have had technology if there was not some science involved, and no science without technology, even though technology would have come first in the sense of we need it first. But science and mathematics that was developed, and Greece is not the place that it developed first. You have Egypt and Babylonia, and you have other places where a scientific attitude and a scientific sort of system had developed. India, of course. So there was, but we are looking at the Mediterranean world right now. So there was elementary generalization, but only as far as it was useful for practical application, right? So they would know the uses of fire, water, maybe, the basic properties of certain objects like, that we use around us, basic geometry even. They were very good at building, building things. You have the Egyptian pyramids, for example, that could not have been built without, a great understanding of science and mathematics. But the generalization stopped at the point, let's say, where the practical purpose was fulfilled. They would need a very sort of, subtle and fine development of science and mathematics to build the pyramids in the first place. But the further generalization to the nature of things, well, it might have taken place. The thing is that I would say that I'm more sort of attuned to Greek philosophy and Greek thought. So for those of you who might have studied Egyptian thought, maybe you could tell us more about it. But what we're looking at the Greeks is that they went one step further towards abstraction, right? And this demand for abstraction, for generalization, led to a discovery of form and structure, right? That's what they kept looking for. We talked about the arche earlier, and we'll talk about structure again later. And they went from the specific or individual or particular to the general, to the universal. They tried to come up with, general and universal explanations of things. And that meant that they tried to get to forms in the sense of concepts and notions, right? A conceptual understanding. So they tried to get to these universal concepts, these universal notions, which would explain, much further than what, basic practical use could. And so then they started asking questions like, is there an origin of all things? And is there an origin? Is there an end of all things? Or is the universe infinite? Is the world composed of many substances? Is it composed of just one substance? If it is composed of only one substance, what could it be? If it is composed of many substances, is this infinitely many substances, or is it composed of just a few kinds of substances which then combine to make infinite things? So, question of what is the world composed of, right? So the desire was really a desire to find a complete description which explains, which gives a complete account of the universe, of physis, of nature, right? So it was this desire to find a logos, one account, which would explain physis. this led, of course, to them making many leaps of imagination, right? So if some things can be explained via that one account, then good. If not, then let's sort of, try and fit everything in. So in some ways, they were not like modern scientists, because instead of saying that, my theory cannot explain this one thing. This theory sounds good for explaining 5 things, but it cannot explain that one other thing. So instead of saying, yeah, I'm not sure about this theory, they would try and make the theory more general, more inclusive. So they would always choose theory first in some ways. So that was, again, one old-fashioned method. And the thing is that they are not the last ones to do it. There are still people who do it. But science has sort of changed a lot in the last couple of centuries. So now this attitude towards science would be less acceptable than it was then. But this was the beginning of science and philosophy. So that's what they would do. They would choose theory, usually, over experiment, if the experiment doesn't work. And also experimental sort of techniques were not that developed. So that's what, when we talk about the beginning of philosophy, as I said, like to summarize the whole thing, it begins. I mean, we could have a debate about this, of course. I'm not saying that this is a dogma that you should believe, but if we accept the Aristotelian sort of explanation that philosophy begins in wonder, and it is in the nature of human beings to wonder, because it's in the nature of human beings to long for knowledge, then we can start thinking of, how it would have begun at that particular time. Why did it take that particular form? Why were those particular questions asked? So that, it could set the spark for the beginning of the coeval beginning, as I've said in my sort of course description, of philosophy and science. Thank you.